yearly program, I would like to welcome you all to this lecture, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend, Professor Rudolph Ware, who is an Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. A historian of Africa and Islam, he earned his PhD in 2004 at the University of Pennsylvania, where he trained in African history, African American history, and Islamic intellectual history. His research spans the last 1,000 years, centering on West Africa while reaching into the Mediterranean lands of Islam and the Atlantic worlds of the African diaspora. What has it meant to be an African Muslim? This question impressed him across space and time, leading him to publish works on the histories of Quran schooling, Islamic mysticism, slavery and abolition, and Islamic devotional poetry. He investigates mainly with the tools of an historian, but his approach is interdisciplinary. His research relies on conventional sources on African historiography, archival and documentary work in European languages, and oral history in African languages. Yet his methods have been deeply shaped by the Arabic textualist tradition, anthropology, and philosophy. So, although he writes as an historian, he sees himself as straddling a crossroads where two broad interdisciplinary fields meet. His work seeks to engage with, intervene in, and push the edges of African and Islamic studies. His teaching focuses on Islamic thought, anti-slavery movements in West Africa and the African diaspora, and the broader intersection of race, religion, and revolutionary thought. He has published a number of articles on these interrelated themes, as well as 2 books. The first one, The Walking Quran, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge and History in West Africa. So this is the most profound and influential book in the field of African study of Islam in Africa that I know. The first 2 chapters of the Walking Quran are an interdisciplinary inquiry into the philosophy of knowledge behind classical Quran schooling. The remaining 5 chapters use this institution, that is the Quranic school, as a lens to view a millennium of West African history. The resultant story is grounded in academic conventions of documentation and citation, but it is an attempt to see through the looking glass of epistemological history. The Working Quran is not only an analysis of an African and Islamic approach to knowledge, it is also an effort to write a history through it. His most recent book, co-authored with Dr. Zachary Wright and Dr. Amir Said, and also with important contributions from classically trained scholar Sheikh Muhammad Sharif, explores Sufi thought in West Africa. Today, Professor Ware will deliver a lecture entitled Race, Religion and Revolution, Spirituality and Social Change in Islamic Africa, in Islamic West Africa since 1770. So, without further ado, I will turn the floor to him, but please join me in welcoming him to our.
Thank you, Dr. Khan, for that generous introduction. Thank you, Farah and Mariam, for helping arrange this visit. It's an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to be back amongst you, speaking at Harvard. The topic of today's lecture is drawn from if you can believe it, 3 different books. The first is the one that Professor Khan just mentioned, my first published monograph, The Walking Quran, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge, and History in West Africa. Briefly, the argument of that book, for people who aren't familiar with it, is actually visually represented on the cover. It's one of those cases where a picture actually is worth 1,000 words, because the argument of that book is that the classical approach to Islamic education, which you still see, was not designed to produce simply analytical knowledge or understanding of the Quran, but rather to reproduce a form of textual embodiment, to reproduce flesh and blood and bone human beings as living exemplars of Islam's holy text, and then to allow that knowledge to flow from one generation to another in order to reproduce a particular set of sensibilities and embodiment of Islamic values and character. We're going to come back to that book in a minute. It's also drawn from a book that I'm writing called The First Atlantic Revolution, Islam, Abolition, and Republic before 1776, which grows out of a chapter in the Walking Quran. We'll have a lot to say about that as well. And finally, it's drawn from a third book. I'm writing the last 2 books contemporaneously. They're both about 50,000 words in. We're not sure which one's going to get to the finish line first. But any prayers that you can offer for a scholar that's trying to write 2 books at the same time, I accept your supplications. The last manuscript, and we'll come back to this as well, but I wanted to give you kind of an intellectual trajectory for the talk, is a book that's called Visionaries, Second Sight, and Social Change in Islamic West Africa. And it's about the relationship between the 2 senses of the word visionary in the English language, someone who sees things in trances, dreams, waking states, has visionary experiences, and a visionary leader, somebody who provides imaginative, transformational leadership for social change. And the vision of visionaries, if I can use a bad pun, is to examine the relationship between how the unseen world is conceived and understood in West African Muslim society, and how conceptions of the unseen world shape visions of social change in the seen world. And we're going to come back to that at the end of the talk, because that's also what the theme about race, religion, and revolution is really about. It's about understanding how interventions in the unseen world shape social outcomes in the seen world. So, in order to get us in to the topic of today's talk, which is largely about an anti-slavery revolution in the Senegal River Valley that runs from 1770 to 1806, I'm going to start you with a quotation that frames some of the important stakes in the work that I'm doing. This is from an evangelical Christian text written in the 1840s by a scholar who, it's called Pro-Slavery Interpretations of the Bible That Are Productive of Infidelity. Its author was concluding that efforts to proselytize Christianity amongst enslaved Africans were doomed to failure when the Bible was being used as a weapon to hit enslaved Africans over the head with in the U.S. South. Serve your masters on earth, and one day you'll get to serve them in heaven too. He argued was not a particularly compelling way to convince enslaved Africans to convert to Christianity. He assembled, bless you, not only biblical interpretations that argued against the morality of slavery in the U.S. context, but he also assembled a number of stories that he thought illustrated the point that he wished to make. One of them caught my attention for reasons that will become clear by the end of the talk. In the year 1806, on the arrival of a slaver from the coast of Africa, John Doherty went to the city of Savannah to buy slaves. After several hundred had been sold in lots and single, a suit of the purchasers, a middle-aged man, was put upon the stand who wished to make a communication before he was sold, the purport of which was that he was a Mohammedan, and that whenever the hour of prayer and other devotional duties came, he must have time to attend them. Mr. D, who had lately embraced religion and seemed to be zealous to promote the cause, gave the highest price for him, feeling confident within himself that he would soon convert him to the true faith. Taking him to his plantation, he built him a hut and assured him that he should be allowed the time he required, and in addition should have every opportunity to attend all the meetings of the Christians. The Mohammedan slave for a while attended these meetings and learned something of Christianity, without, however, discontinuing his former devotions. At the expiration of about a year, his master, who was intent on his conversion, asked him formally if he did not prefer Christianity to Mohammedanism, and if he would not openly renounce the prophet and acknowledge Jesus Christ. The slave asked if the Christian religion allowed one Christian to hold another in slavery and their children after him. The answer, of course, was in the affirmative. The Mohammedan replied that the religion of the prophet did not allow that. The result of all was this slave, in a land of Bibles and gospel ministers, daily said his prayers, performed ablutions, made his prostrations, and at an advanced age died, declaring that God was one God, and Muhammad was his prophet. What kinds of Islamic sensibilities, institutions, historical experiences shaped the discourse pronounced by that man on a Savannah dock in 1806, or on his master's plantation a little over a year later. Today's intervention is designed largely to recenter Africa and the African diaspora, and also the religion of Islam, in the way that we think about specifically the Atlantic Age of Revolution, but also in a broader sense to center Africa, the diaspora, and Islam in the way that we think about transformational social change. The kinds of sensibilities expressed by that man, whose name is not known to us, were first cultivated in these kinds of schools, the Quran schools that I write about in the Walking Quran, where children, boys and girls, learn to embody the text. I mention boys and girls because it's worth noting that while the example that opens our talk is an enslaved male African, that girls represented between 20 and 40% of the contingent in Quran schools in West Africa for all of the periods that I've been able to document for the last 1,000 years. Just to provide some context, there were European countries don't reach 20% of their scholarly population as being female until the 20th century in most cases. So these sensibilities that are shaped in Quran school were accompanied by the development of widespread literacy skills. And those institutions which shaped the sensibilities of Muslims in the past, learning the Quran on these wooden tablets, sitting in circles around a teacher or around a monitor who is himself studying the advanced religious sciences while he's teaching the Quran to children. Those institutions have not died out in Senegal or in West Africa. Indeed, in the region that I'm going to be talking about today, Fouta-Toro, where this revolution took place, you can still see the same kinds of schools functioning. It's pretty much the only place left anywhere in the Muslim world where the basic form of elementary Islamic education is learning the Quran on these wooden tablets, which, as I'm able to document in the Walking Quran, is how the Quran was first taught in the Prophet's own community, according to the surviving sources, that the Quran was learned on these wooden boards and also written on the broad, wide shoulder bones of cattle and camels, which provided a nice writing surface. They don't use those very much in Senegal. In Mauritania, they still do sometimes use shoulder bones of camels. But in Senegal and most of West Africa, it's the wooden tablets. The wooden tablets are also used for drafting when you don't want to use paper. So poetry is sometimes drafted in this form. And there's a very particular kind of textuality that comes into being. And after basic memorization, the student who was monitoring the beginning Quran school students in the previous picture would spend his late mornings or afternoons in a gathering such as this one, learning the advanced disciplines of the Islamic religious sciences, including Islamic law, theology, spirituality or Sufism, But the legal sensibility, and we're going to come back to the legal sensibility that was being expressed when that man said that the law of the Prophet does not allow Muslims to own one another and their children after them. That interpretation of what Islamic law does and doesn't allow with respect to slavery is something that's almost unique in the annals of Islamic history to this period and place in West Africa. Because as students of Islam will know, most of the established legal authorities in the four traditional schools say it is permissible for Muslims to own other Muslims as slaves as long as their conversion to Islam is subsequent to their capture, and that children born to Muslim slaves need not necessarily be liberated except under a specific set of circumstances. When a person in 1806 says that God's law does not allow Muslims to own other Muslims and their children after them, they're making a radical revolutionary statement. And they're making a radical revolutionary statement because that man was captured in the very last battles that ended a revolution that had sought to end slavery in the Senegal River Valley for 36 years. We'll get there in a minute. So Islamic law and legal understandings being cultivated in these spaces so that people can become copies not just of Islam's sacred texts, but also that they understand and embody the legal and ethical principles of the religion so that they're able to spontaneously improvise new solutions to whatever the problems of an individual's life or even an age might throw at them. The argument could be visually depicted in this way, but it could also be visually depicted in this way. The part of what I need to say to Islamic studies audiences is that for the most part, gatherings such as this one have ignored Africa in telling the intellectual history of Islam and Islamic thought. It usually goes unstated that Africa is actually the only continent in the world that has a Muslim majority, that there are 330 million Muslims that live in sub-Saharan Africa, which is more than twice the number of Muslims that live in North Africa. Africa is usually marginal to the story of Islamic thought and Islamic history in spite of the efforts of pioneering scholars such as the man seated to my right hand right now. Africa remains marginal in many discourses about Islam. People don't know that there are more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in Egypt, that there are more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq, that there's a higher percentage of Muslims in Senegal than there is in Syria. Islam is thought of as being something that's foreign and external to the African tradition rather than something that's an integral part of it. And furthermore, Africa is usually perceived as a place where Islamic culture is received rather than a place that can give lessons in understanding what Islam actually is. So another way of visually representing the argument in my first book is with this 16th century Turkish miniature of the second adult male to accept the religion of Islam, Bilal, an enslaved African who was freed by the Prophet's friend Abu Bakr, and who stood atop the Kaaba, the house that Muslims believe to be constructed by Abraham and Ismail, and called the people to the religion. The first chapter of the introduction to the Walking Quran is framed by a hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet, emulate the blacks. For from among them are three lords of the people of paradise, Luqman the sage, Bilal, the Negus of Abyssinia, and Bilal the Mu'attib. Luqman was a pre-Islamic sage of the Arabian Peninsula who was dark in skin color. The Christian king of Abyssinia gave shelter to the Muslims before the Hijra began Muslim time, before the year 0 in the Muslim calendar, and Bilal was the first called the people to prayer. And the basic argument, to make a long story short, on this point is that if the Prophet of Islam considered black people as exemplars of knowledge and piety in the religion, then Islamic studies should be paying attention to black people too. But as Professor Khan just mentioned, it's not just about drawing our attention to Africa. The basic approach in the Walking Quran, and we're going to come back to the implications of this for humanistic study in a moment, is to actually try not just to tell a story about an epistemology of embodiment, but to write a history from within it. To take on the categories of seeing people as physical exemplars of a sacred text, and to use those as an analytic from within which you see a history. So that each chapter of the Walking Quran after the introduction and the first chapter are not an attempt to explain to you how I think an epistemology of embodiment works in African Islamic education. It's to put on the glasses of that epistemology and write a history from within that viewpoint. And the most striking intellectual payoff for that approach, for me, came in chapter 3 of that book, and that led on to this book, The First Atlantic Revolution. Chapter 3, The Book and Chain, Slavery and Revolution in Senegal. In that chapter, I ask a question at the outset, which is that if the people are the books in West African Islam, and especially if scholars who have memorized the Quran before they are given authorizations to teach it are particularly honored exemplars of not just knowledge and piety, but are thought of as being physical copies of what Muslims understand to be God's verbatim speech, then what will be the response in West African society to the abuse and enslavement of people who are thought of as living copies of the text? And this question came to me when I was beginning the writing of that first book in 2006, when Terry Jones, you guys remember Terry Jones? Does that name ring a bell? The preacher in Florida who wanted to stage a demonstration of burning as many physical copies of the Quran as he said, buy a copy of the Quran, come bring it, we're going to start a big old bonfire. And Obama was like, please don't do that. We don't want every American everywhere in every Muslim country to be assassinated at the same time. So I asked myself a question, which is that if the desecration of ink and paper copies of the Quran is enough to set the Muslim world in an uproar in 2006, what about centuries of the abuse and enslavement of human beings who were thought of as embodied in the text? Once I started to see this as a potentially inflammatory moment in the social history of West Africa, I realized that there were actually more than 70 instances where the enslavement of clerics had served as proximate cause for an uprising or rebellion, or in one very prominent case, a revolution. I detailed that in chapter 3 of the Walking Quran. I won't go into all of those details to rehearse them now, but I'm going to tell you the story that grows out of it. Within this epistemology of embodiment, enslavement of the keepers of the Quran, people who were themselves copies of the Quran. Hufaz al-Quran means literally people that preserve the book or keep it. From within this epistemology, in their enslavement was akin to a desecration of the Quran. At the same time, they were tearing pages out of a mushaf, of a physical copy of the Quran, and flushing them down the toilet in Abu Ghraib to torment Muslim prisoners with the spectacle of the abuse of the Quran. So I was reflecting, how are people going to understand this spectacle? And all of a sudden, you see all of these revolutions and rebellions and uprisings coming at this moment when exemplars of piety are enslaved by the slave military class, which is known for consumption of trade brandy, or by Moorish populations, which have raided the Senegal River Valley for about 150 years before this revolution starts in 1770. Once I was on the track of that story of this revolution, which was sparked by spectacles of the abuse and enslavement of cherished religious scholars in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s, I found that I wasn't, in fact, the first person to have written about it. That the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, had spent more than 30% of the total page count in the first book that he ever published on abolition in describing the revolution in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s and 1780s. He devoted the last words of that text to praising Imam Abdul Qadir Khan. Al-Mami is the Fulani version of the term El-Imam. So I'll read it for effect. Because he also explains that Abdul Qadir Khan, in sometime between 1776 and 1786, abolished the institution of slavery in the Senegal River Valley, and that this was the first time in human history that a modern state had abolished the institution of slavery. He says, to the sovereigns of Europe, the wise and virtuous Al-Mami sets an illustrious example in extirpating the commerce and the human race. And when we consider this amiable man as having been trained up in the land of slavery, having had in the introduction of such a revolution all the prejudices of education and custom to oppose, when we consider him again as sacrificing a part of his own revenue, as refusing the presence of Europeans and exposing himself in consequence of it to the vindictive ravages of the agents of the latter, he is certainly more to be respected than any of the sovereigns of Europe, inasmuch as he has made a much nobler sacrifice than they and has done more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion. Is this how your introduction to the history of abolitionist thought was framed? Or was it told to you the way that it was told to me, that abolitionist thought emerged fully formed like Athena from the waves out of the imagination and good conscience of Christian do-gooders who saw the slave trade as a moral abomination and were ultimately able to persuade all the less advanced, less progressive races of humanity to follow their lead? Raise your hand if that's the story you heard. Okay, good. So we're on the same page. Thomas Clarkson was not only the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, he was the tutor for William Wilberforce in all matters of abolition, and he was also the charter founding member of La Société des Amis de Noirs, the first French abolition society. He couldn't be the founder in name because it would have been a huge embarrassment, given the whole England-France thing, to have the actual founder named as Clarkson, but he was on the founding board, and his letters reveal that it was, in fact, his idea. The creation of the Society for the Friends of the Blacks came from Clarkson. And in fact, his first version of these letters on the slave trade, published in 1791, were written in French in manuscript form in 1788 and published and circulated in France before they were actually circulated in English. He translated his own work back into English as a way to give a spark to the British abolitionist movement. Clarkson says, not satisfied with these proceedings, he made a decree, again talking about Abdul Qadir Khan, who gets to in a moment, as a discouragement to the slave trade in the beginning of the year 1787, that whereas slaves made in other countries have been accustomed to be passed in their way to Fort St. Louis, as a Saint-Louis, former capital of Senegal, that passing on their way to Fort St. Louis through his dominions, that he would block such passage in the future, and accordingly at the proper season of the year, he put his decree into execution by stopping the passage of slaves. They tried him next by many and rich presents, but he sent them all back, adding that he would not only hinder the route of slaves for that year, but as long as he should live. And that if the whites should attempt any depredations on his subject in consequence of his determination, he would retaliate. His next step was to prohibit the sale of the persons of men and to abolish personal slavery in his own dominions, giving encouragement to agriculture and manufacture in that place. Clarkson doesn't have the date of that effective abolition quite right. His main source for it is a French botanist called René Geoffroy de Villeneuve, who is resident on the mainland between 1785 and 1787, who speaks fluent Wolof, and who has been at the court of various kings throughout the region, and he is getting the story of this abolition without getting precise dating of the oral material. So he thinks that this decree had just taken place a few years before Clarkson wrote. Internal oral historical sources and other contemporary documentation indicate that that abolition that Khan attempted to institute, establishing personal slavery and stopping the passage of slaves, had actually happened in 1776, a good year for revolutions. Although we sold out on the whole 3/5 of a person. Clarkson is not the only source. I can't give you all of them in a short presentation, but pro-slavery sources, slave ship captains, anti-slavery sources, oral traditions, Arabic textual documents, documents written in African languages using the Arabic script, all converge around this narrative that in the middle of the 1770s, an African Muslim ruler abolished the institution of slavery and sought to put an end to the slave trade in its entirety. One of the sources is the later governor of Senegal, Baron Roger, who was actually resident in the colony of Senegal in the 1780s. He notes in one of his accounts that no free Fula man, Fula being the predominant ethnic group in Fututoro, the northern part of the country, could ever be more reduced to captivity, that trade would introduce no new slaves into the country, and that every former slave who could read a passage from the Quran would immediately gain his freedom. He's mistranslating here one key word that has been told to him by his oral sources. The internal discourses make it clear that every former slave who could recite a passage from the Quran would immediately gain their freedom. It's not just an ammunition that's offered to male slaves, nor is it only one that's offered to literate slaves. The oral traditions make it clear that during Khan's regime of government, any enslaved person that fled from neighboring polities and set foot in Fututoro was free as soon as they recited a single verse of the Quran. For Khan, who was himself a legal scholar, it wasn't just integral copies of the Quran that ought to be protected from the indignities of enslavement. It was any single verse of the Quran that ought to be protected from the indignities of enslavement. When I tell this story to my undergraduate students, they sometimes protest and say, yeah, but he's still only protecting Muslims from enslavement. He's not protecting everyone from enslavement, and therefore you cannot think of this as a universal abolition, which is an important point to make. It's one that's also directly addressed in the oral traditions of Fututoro. Abdul Qadir Khan is reported to have said, the Muslim that should be protected from the indignities of enslavement is the one that says La ilaha illallah, even if they pronounce it Ra ilaha illallah. What he was saying is, pretend that to be Muslim, and I will use my understanding of Islam's legal protections to shield you from the indignities of enslavement. The operative notion here is also that throughout this region, with the exception of few groups in southern Senegambia, everyone defines themselves as Muslim publicly anyway. The people that he's addressing with this Ra, that was the Fulani stereotype of the speech of Serer and Jola speakers that were from the southern part of Senegambia. And he was saying, listen, I don't really need to know what you believe. Say this word, and I will set you free. A quick point on when that happened. 1776 is what the internal sources show as when he offers this emancipation. And he offers it at a time when this anti-slavery revolution has suffered dramatic setbacks because of the actions of the British colonial governor of Senegambia, who has unleashed Moorish forces on the Senegal River Valley to try to quell this revolution. He writes to his superiors, this is Charles O'Hara, that in 6 months the Moors enslaved 5,000 of the people of Fututoro in an effort to try to quell this revolution. The founder of this abolitionist movement, a person called Suleiman Baal, is actually killed in one of those battles. And Abdul Qadir Khan comes to power only at that time in 1776. The explanation that I offer for how he's able to turn the tide of a battle, of a war that's going against the anti-slavery movement at this point in time is he uses what you will think of as the Lincoln move. He offers freedom to the slaves of his enemies. Except he's doing it 90 years before Lincoln. It's not the Lincoln move. It's the Abdul Qadir Khan move. And it makes all the sense in the world because in a world where political, economic, and military strength is all reckoned in slaves, then freeing the slaves of your enemy is a way of militarily, politically, and economically weakening them. He first sets free the slaves in Fukutoro, then he offers to the freedom to the enslaved people in Moorish society for them to come over to his side and fight against their erstwhile masters. I'll tell you what, if you had made that offer in Mississippi in 1861, 1862, you've gotten a lot more people on your side. We're going to give you guns and allow you to hunt your former masters. This revolution, which sounds so preposterous in its abolitionist impulses, given everything that we've been taught, was matter-of-factly narrated by an entire generation of European observers. The last British governor of Senegambia mentioned it only in passing when he was talking about other things. It may be necessary here to remark that there's been greater facility in negotiating with Al-Mami and less probability of again having disputes with him in consequence of the abolition of the slave trade and commerce which that prince always opposed as being contrary to the laws of his religion, and the means through which several of his subjects, followers of the prophet, were led into captivity. He's talking here about the abolition of the slave trade by Britain in 1807. And he's basically saying, our relations with the people of Fukutoro have really improved since we abolished the slave trade the same way that they did, 30 years ago. Baron Roger, again, that same French governor, said nothing could take away from them the idea that in forbidding the trade in slaves, the Europeans were emboldened by their example. He's talking about the Africans. They are proud to have bypassed us in the progress of reason, justice, and humanity. Everyone knew about this abolition because slave traders knew that you couldn't go to Senegambia to buy slaves anymore for an extended period of time. It was not a secret in the contemporary sources of the time. Slave traders wrote about it, anti-slavery voices wrote about it, anybody that had spent extensive time in Senegambia wrote about it, including the Scottish explorer Mungo Park, who will come back into our story in just a minute. But before he does, I want to expand the revolutionary lens, because one of the offshoots of this initial revolution in the Senegal River Valley is that it sparks a very similar revolution in northern Nigeria just a few years after the resistance of Abdul Qadir Khan had proven to be successful. A generation ago, Humphrey Fisher wrote a piece about Usman Dan Fodio, the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate, the largest territorial state in 19th century Africa. And he called it a Muslim Wilberforce, Dan Fodio and the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate. That the internal oral historical sources from within Hausa-speaking communities highlighted that the struggle to establish this new polity and to make war with the Hausa states that Usman Dan Fodio eventually entered into conflict with was largely driven by the fact that the rulers of those states, just like the rulers in the Senegambian states, were trading Muslims for rum and guns and fine garments. And that this was the proximate cause for Dan Fodio's resistance to them. And in fact, once I started looking into broader sources throughout West Africa, Dan Fodio actually resists calls from many of his people to direct a war to end the reign of these slaving kings, until two things happened. 300 of his soldiers, who were all Hafiz al-Quran, who were all people who had memorized the Quran in its entirety, were captured in a skirmish between his men and the Sultan of Gobir. And after that skirmish, instead of being ransomed, those 300 integral copies of the Quran were sold as slaves through Yoruba country. At this moment, you can almost picture Dan Fodio saying, that's the last straw, we ain't got nothing left between us but war. But he demurred in this instance because he was waiting for something that he did not yet have. He was waiting for divine permission for his revolution. And the reason why I bring this part of the story here is that shortly after that episode took place, he had a dream where he saw the founder of his own Sufi order, Abdul Qadir Jilani, a sheikh from Baghdad who had lived and died several centuries earlier. And he saw the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, together in a dream. And they handed him the sword of truth. And they explicitly gave him permission to make war against the people that were making war on him. It was not the sociological or the historical affront that pushed Don Fodio to take up this revolutionary form of social change. It was an eruption from the unseen world into the seen world that compelled a man who had been trying to avoid a military conflict for at least 12 years to finally take up arms when he did not want to take up arms. Because in point of fact, clerics in West Africa had no military experience. They had been forced to swear political neutrality and been prevented from bearing arms in most West African Muslim societies for 500 or 600 years before the abominations of the slave trade caused them to consider taking radical military action. And one thing about the revolution, and this is just new material that I've received from Matthew Schumann, a PhD student at Princeton, is that he's actually been able to uncover a Shadhali silsila, a chain of initiation into the Shadhaliya for Abdul Qadir Khan, the author of the Emancipation Proclamation. He discovered it in a series of Mauritanian texts that trace their chains of transmission. So we've had stories about the Qadiriyya and the Tijaniyya being associated with radical political action, and now we've got the Shadhali on board as well. There are actually traditions about divine permissions that Khan received, and that's the main project of my next research trip to Senegal, is to work on this relationship between the unseen and the seen world. If you want to know more about what I think about Don Fodio's revolution, check out Africa's Great Civilizations, which I filmed the last time that I was here. Episode 5, The Age of Revolution. You see how I snuck in like multiple plugs? First, the Walking Quran, go buy my book. Then, go check out the DVD. So this brings us to this, the question of a vision. And I want to just take a break in the narrative about the revolution itself to take a step back and to interrogate the way in which we, as university academics, understand the relationship between religious experience and radical social change. Most of our theories and approaches to understanding social change are drawn from a blatantly materialist understanding of how social change functions in human society. It's driven by sociological explanations, historical explanations, political, economic, and military explanations. Yet what's striking as you dig into each one of the stories that is behind radical social change in Islamic West Africa is that it's almost always an eruption from the unseen world into the seen world that causes fundamental social change. The basic argument of visionaries is that the entire religion of Islam is nothing other than an eruption from the unseen world, the revelation of the Quran, into the path of human history, which causes dramatic and transformative social change. For what is the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad, peace be upon him, except the quintessential visionary experience? What is it to see an angel that speaks to you and presses upon your body to get you to bring forth a word from yourself that you do not know? What is it if not a visionary experience to have God's words recited to you so that they're imprinted upon your heart? And what is it if not a connection between visionary in the spiritual sense and visionary in the social sense, to then go forth armed with certainty that doesn't come from this world, but that comes from the next, that you are capable of radically transforming the course of human history if you would only have the courage to manifest the vision. If you would only have the courage to go forth and fulfill the word that has been written upon your heart. I had been collecting stories about dreams and important waking state visions from different West African scholars, male and female, for about a decade. And I didn't understand why I was collecting them until I heard a story about the founder of the Muridiyya, Ahmadu Bamba, and a waking vision that he had in 1895, where he formed a compact with the Prophet to begin a nonviolent transformational movement. And I realized that everything that I had learned about this Sufi movement and what it ultimately became in sociological and historical terms had actually been traced out in a vision that a man had in a mosque one day. And that's when I knew that what we actually need to be thinking about is how from within Islamic epistemologies, African epistemologies, indigenous epistemologies, which always see the unseen world and the seen worlds as tethered to one another, and that the unseen world is more durable and more lasting, and that the seen world is temporary and transient. So the interventions that come from that hidden space are the only thing that are actually capable of transforming this transient, dying world. A lot more I could say about that. Oxford's gives the following two primary definitions of visionary. Original one showing the ability to think or plan with great imagination and intelligence, relating to dreams or strange experiences, especially of religious time. The definition two is what gives birth to definition one. Which brings me to my recent move to UC Santa Barbara after 10 years at the University of Michigan. The most compelling part of the offer that took me out of the cold Midwestern winters and put me in an office that's 100 yards from the Pacific Ocean was not, in point of fact, the weather. It was the opportunity to create the initiative for the study of race, religion, and revolution with funding from the Dean's office to make this a conversation that's about Isra, Arabic speakers in the audience, secret hidden knowledge, a conversation about how secret hidden knowledge informs the way that we understand transformative social change. So anybody that's interested in interrogating these spaces where spiritual and religious thought, especially the spiritual and religious thought of non-Western populations, how it forms a framework for how radical social change is understood or enacted, come see me by the beach. Part of it came with a half teaching load for the first few years, and most of that teaching load is a 2-quarter graduate seminar where I can invite visiting scholars every 2 weeks to give presentations on anything that connects the intersection between race, religion, and revolutionary thought. This ain't just about Islam, this ain't just about Africa. This is about anybody that's interested in exploring relations between the seen and the unseen as they inform the way that we think about social change. And it's also part of how we bring Islamic and African epistemologies out of the ghettos in which they currently reside. Where the people that want to pay attention to Islam will pay attention to Islam, or people that want to pay attention to Africa will pay attention to Africa. This is an initiative funded by the Dean that's meant to be at the heart of humanist inquiry at UCSB. The idea is to take the kinds of conversations that Usman Danfodio and Khan were having, and the kinds of conversations that we're cultivating in these rooms, and ask questions from within the framework of non-Western systems of thought about how we should theorize social change. So back to Danfodio, and we'll start to move things to the conclusion. One of the things that we know from the expansion of this revolutionary movement from the Senegal River Valley, 1,500 miles to the east of northern Nigeria, is that when Hausa kings were in military conflict with Danfodio's community, and the clerical community lost major battles. There were sometimes dramatic incidents of the enslavement of clerics and religious scholars, and we have documented instances of those religious scholars turning up in significant numbers, beginning in the 1780s and 1790s in Bahia, Brazil, that there's a direct pipeline from Nigeria through slave trading circuits to Brazil, and that a large concentration of Muslims, many of whom have experience in anti-slavery warfare in West Africa, are being gathered together in a single space. And there's surviving texts of them planning slave rebellions using the Arabic language and using the Hausa language written with the Arabic script to plan slave rebellions. So I started asking myself, questions. Well, if the revolution in Sokoto could be exported to Brazil, what about the revolution in the Senegal River Valley that preceded it? Maybe this is an Atlantic revolution, not just in the sense that it was discussed by the Reverend Thomas Clarkson and led to the founding of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade and the French Société des Amis des Noirs. But maybe it's an Atlantic story because I can trace it into slave barracks. Spoiler alert. I've traced it into The reason is that there are still surviving texts written by some people. It's not just pronouncements like that man on that Savannah dock in 1806. In the years after the American Revolution and the years after the West African Revolution that I've been describing in Senegambia, there was a more or less direct pipeline between Senegambia and South Carolina and Georgia. When you study the demographic shifts in the slave trade, there's a significant spike just due to accidents in which American slavers are running which routes. But they lead to an intense concentration of slaves from Senegambia in the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands in the 1780s, 1790s, and 1800s. That man standing on that Savannah dock with which I opened is not an outlier. He is at part of what is at a specific moment of plurality amongst the enslaved community. And they've left traces behind. This is a text that's written by, it's one of two famous Bilalis from the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands. It's an attempt to write from memory legal text that he had learned in one of those study circles that was depicted at the beginning of this presentation. He wasn't a fully accomplished scholar himself. He hadn't completed a full cycle of study, so he sometimes substitutes scenes for sods, but he's writing phonetically from memory the legal text that he had studied as a child in order to leave a document to instruct his children who were still in slavery on how to pray. In WPA slave narratives in the 1930s, the last generation to have witnessed and lived through slavery provide accounts from their own living memory about the survival of Islam in the American Muslim, in the American community and in the African American community at that time. This is a different Bilali. There were many Bilalis, by the way. I'll say something about that in a minute. They used to say that Bilali and his wife Phoebe pray on the bead. They were very particular about the time they prayed, and they're very regular about the hour when the sun come up, when it's straight overhead, and when it's set, that's the time they pray. They vow to the sun to have a little mat to kneel on, the beads on a long string. Bilali pull the bead, and he say, Bilali Hakabah Muhammad. Phoebe, she say, Ameen, Ameen. Islam that was brought doesn't just die. It exists in living memory down into the 1930s. In spite of the incredible obstacles, both in leaving surviving documentary traces and oral traces. And just because I'm giving myself a little time since Professor Khan's generous introduction was took 5 of my minutes, I'm going to take them back to tell a joke. That helps highlight for you the methodological imperative for us as scholars and historians to think creatively and imaginatively about how we can interrogate sources to redress the imbalances of power that have made it so difficult for these people to leave these traces. So here's the joke. Any Chris Rock fans out there? Don't give away the punchline if you heard this one before. So Chris Rock tells a story about an enslaved chauffeur, an enslaved carriage driver, okay? And because he's a carriage driver, he has like liberty of movement that ordinary slaves don't have. He can go from town to town, place to place, carriage master around, and he makes connections that ordinary slaves don't have, and he's been secretly learning to read some of the time when he's away from the plantation, and master doesn't know where he is. He says, so one day, this slave carriage driver is driving the master into town, and he sees a carriage coming from the right-hand side, speeding into the same intersection that he's headed to, and he knows that it's likely to lead to a crash. But he's presented with a dilemma, because he sees a stop sign on the corner. It requires you to suspend your disbelief, right? You have to imagine a stop sign in slavery times. But it's to make a specific point. So you see the driver's dilemma, right? What's the dilemma? If it stops, then it means that he's revealed the fact that he can read. And what's going to happen to him if it's known that he's going to read? He's going to get a tree put on his back. That's what's going to happen. He's going to have lashes put across his back until they form the shape of a tree. Because literacy is a danger to slave society. This, in spite of the fact that, as Sylviane Diouf mentions, that there are documented instances of enslaved African Muslims keeping plantation records for their masters in Arabic because of the widespread literacy in West Africa and the low rates of literacy in the U.S. South. They kept plantation records for their masters in Arabic, but their masters couldn't read any language. But yet, the ideology of enslavement is such that if he reveals that he can read, he is going to get lashes. Okay, so now back to the joke. So, you see the dilemma. What's the carriage driver going to do? He's going to crash that carriage. Because he may or may not survive the carriage crash, but he knows he's going to get lashes if it's revealed that he can read. And those lashes are often fatal. People get infections and they never recover. They die, oftentimes within a week or a month after, serious lashes. So he crashes the two carriages. Miraculously, everybody survives. His owner is furious. He said, boy, what's the matter with you? You ain't see that stop sign on the corner? So he said, you mean that red octagon-shaped sign on the corner, boss? You think that's the punchline, but that's not the punchline. The punchline is, master says to him, nigga, who taught you octagon? Do you feel me? Mm-hmm. The power relations inhering in slavery make it almost impossible for enslaved people to leave the kinds of documentary traces that we as historians and students of the past from other disciplines would prefer to use as sources. We have got to get hella creative in order to try to recover those voices. Otherwise, we are endorsing the same power dynamics that adhere in that moment. We are, as Rolf Trio might put it, we are affixing the silencer to the end of the imperialist's gun. Until we insert Africa back into these stories, until we find them in slave barracks, until we bring Africa back into the story of Islam, we're endorsing the dynamics that have kept Africans silent in history. I'm just going to begin to close now with a few places where I've been able to track some of this story that I started you with, which is about a revolution in the Senegal River Valley that seeks to abolish slavery, and some of its enslaved lieutenants. So first, Mungo Park. 1796, Mungo Park relates that he is in what's now Mali, when Abdul Qadir Khan loses the first battle that he's lost in 20 years. He's had successful battles for 20 years between 1776 and 1796, but he loses a major battle. 30,000 of his soldiers are defeated by the Gamal of Kajor. Khan himself is taken prisoner and held prisoner before ultimately being released. but all of Khan's primary lieutenants are sold as slaves. Mungo Park mentions that with him on the slave ship, the Charleston, that he was taking to ride to America, were 120 slaves. 25 of them were literate scholars, and I conversed with them in Arabic. He said 9 of them were lieutenants of Abul Qadir Khan, and they told me his story when they were above deck because the Charleston sprang a leak, and the slaves had to be brought above deck in cycles to bail water out of the boat. It couldn't make it all the way to Charleston. It had to come aboard at Antigua instead, which was the closest point they could come aboard. Using the same slave voyages database that I had used to see that bulge in the slave trade from Senegambia to South Carolina and Georgia in the 1780s, I asked myself a question. What was the demography of the slave trade to Antigua in this period? And it turns out there hadn't been any imports from predominantly Muslim areas into Antigua for about 20 years before this happened. So I'm at the British Public Records Office and I'm saying to myself, man, these brothers are going to stick out like a sore thumb in Antigua. If only there were a way I could track them down. So I find that there's a newspaper from Antigua with numbers that go from 1786. And for the year 1796, 6 months after the arrival of this vessel at Antigua, there's a slave rebellion. And right in Antigua's sole colonial newspaper is the account that the slave rebellion was fomented by a mysterious slave known only by the name Gore, which was the port of embarkment for the 9 slaves that had been brought on Mungo Park's ship. I've been able to trace the Al-Mami's lieutenants to rebellions in Antigua. I've been able to track one who fought alongside Khan, who later fought alongside Toussaint Louverture in the Haitian Revolution. I've been able to find an enslaved woman from Futa Toro who was the first free black on state registers in the state of Georgia in 1786, and whose biracial son is fighting as a free man on the 1st Georgia State Militia in 1806. And we've also been able to find that Mohammedan man on the Savannah dock. And there are traces of this revolution being exported from Futa Toro and ideas of liberty with it that can be found from slave barracks from Louisiana to Antigua and everywhere in between. So I'm going to end by asking you the following. Were these Black Atlantic revolutionaries not also part of our genealogy of liberty? Were the Islamic principles by which they enacted their freedom struggle not also part of the story of how we became who we are? And do we not need to redress the imbalances of power in the telling of the stories of Black people and of Muslim people that have kept this story from you until today? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. So we have another 20 minutes. Yes?
Can I sit for questions? No, you can't, I can't say everything, so I will say.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Ware, for that riveting presentation. It was a pleasure to see you talk about this much needed understanding. So the question that I had, I recently reviewed a book about Sheikh Ahmed Bamba that sort of frames him as his peacemaker, right? And in the text, it traces or juxtaposes his sort of peacemaking project with that of Sheikh Usman Danfodio, who is in the book characterized as this person who sort of leads this jihad in an attempt to sort of root out a kind of syncretic reconfiguration of Islam.
There's an Islamic purity argument going on.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that,
Sure.
because this is not the framework that you give us as far as.
Thank you so much for that. So it's you're now also allowing me to open with another shameless plug, which is Jihad of the Pen, which Professor Khan mentioned, which is a collection of translations of Usman Danfodio's writings, Elijah Mahtal's writings, Ahmadou Bamba's writings, and Sheikh Ibrahim Yasser's writings, with my first graduate student, Dr. Zachary Wright, writing an introduction and me writing the conclusion. So you can go on Amazon and get that one too. And it puts Usman Danfodio and Bamba in dialogue, actually, in a single volume. And I actually write about the seeming discrepancy between their visionary experiences in the conclusion to that volume. Because I mentioned that Bamba has this vision where he concludes a non-violent pact with the Prophet. He sees the Prophet and is forbidden from shedding any blood in his particular jihad. The same vision of the Prophet gives Usman Danfodio explicit permission to fight in his. And part of what needs to be understood is that that eruption from the unseen world into the seen world has different implications for different people in different times. When I asked scholars in Senegal about why the discrepancy, why is the Prophet commanding Danfodio to fight and forbidding Ahmadou Bamba from fighting? The first explanation that was given to me by a sheikh, Gambian sheikh actually, was he said the Prophet is always commanded to speak the truth. He said, so just as when he was asked what is the most meritorious act of worship, by one person he said it is to withhold, to control your anger. When he was asked by another person what's the most meritorious act of worship, he said it's visiting your parents. When he was asked by a third person, he said it's jihad for the sake of God. The answer was different in each case because a prophet of God is required to answer the truth of the one who asks them. And for a person who is beating their spouse, controlling their anger is the most meritorious act of jihad. For the person who has abandoned their parents, visiting their parents is the most meritorious act of worship. And if the survival of the Muslim community itself is at stake, then jihad for the sake of God is the most meritorious act. For Danfodio, who had been fleeing from military conflict, he was being given permission to do a thing that he had been contemplating but did not really want to do. Bamba, on the other hand, had worldly aspirations of being a political leader early in his life. And he was being told, if you spill so much of the blood of a scorpion, then the Prophet tells him that your compact with me is broken, I'm not of you, and you are not of me. So they're given radically different counsel, but in each case, it suits the circumstances in which they find themselves. And so that eruption from the unseen into the seen helps them make sense of where they are in their moment. And often these are inconvenient visions. Our socio-historical explanations are usually that the vision is just a pretext to justify an idea that has been, that a decision that's already been made. You pretend to have seen the Prophet so that you can go out and fight because you wanted to fight the whole time, or you convince yourself that you've seen him, or your fervor is such that it causes you to see him. But what was striking in a lot of these stories about dramatic social change is that exactly the opposite of what the person wanted was the thing that they were being told to do. These were inconvenient visions over and over again. And the last thing that I'll say in response to that question, in order to leave time for others, is that there's a direct connection between Bamba and Danfodio on the question of slavery specifically. And Bamba is reported to have said, when he was offered the gift of a slave, before slavery became illegal in the French colony, someone offered him the gift of a slave, and he said, you own this man? And the man who was offering the gift said, yeah, I own it. And he said to him, which means, if you own him, then you own me, because he and I have the same master. this thread of like an abolitionist thread of thought runs from, through Bamba back to Elijah Matal, has this presidentist thought, Usman Danfodio, goes back to the bend of the Niger River. There are 16th century legal scholars writing similar things. This has been an unacknowledged thread in Islamic legal and ethical thought, for centuries. And we tell stories in Islamic studies classrooms. A recently published book by Jonathan Brown, makes you believe that slavery is part and parcel of the Islamic tradition and ought not be necessarily morally condemned. Yet slavery was morally condemned by learned African Muslim scholars themselves, and they drew on the prophetic example and the example of the Prophet's companions to make their cases both legal and ethical. Mm-hmm. And until we recover these stories, we're telling lies about God, we're telling lies about His Prophet, and we're telling lies about history.
Mm-hmm. Yes, teacher.
Thank you so much, Professor Ware. I was really looking forward to this, and you exceeded my expectations. And what I think I really love so much, in all of your work is this focus on a very different form of ontology and epistemology from what people are used to in a Western context, and then how that very much complicates Western notions of progress, particularly with respect to this issue, and how Islamic scholars are actually even opposed to the practice of slavery on different grounds. Right? It's not just what we both think this is evil, it's about what a human being actually is and how you can relate to them. And then it's wonderful seeing you apply your work now in an Atlantic context, in diaspora, because I think it has so much to offer in very new ways that nobody else has done, to my knowledge. And I had a question about the Haitian Revolution, which is clearly the watershed. We know it's been proven now that enslaved Africans all over the Caribbean and the Americas knew about what was going on, and this motivated them, and then that in turn kind of kick-started the abolition movement in many ways. And I've been thinking along very similar lines to you in some ways, and trying to see if there was a connection between Senegal and what was going on in Haiti. And there are some rituals performed in some nations or contexts within Haitian River where they have Senegalese spirits that are dressing in white, speaking Arabic. And then there seem to be some suggestions I've seen of Boukman.
Boukman Dadi,
being Muslim himself, and Boukman being the English one since he was brought from, I believe it was Jamaica.
He was the man of the book.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm curious, you started getting to this with this one scholar, Peridot, but have you been able to find any concrete links? I haven't yet, that show very specifically and directly that people are being brought from that particular area of Senegal to Haiti just before.
Absolutely. So the short answer to the last part of the question is yes. So have others of my colleagues. Rebecca Scott, who I taught with the University of Michigan for a number of years, wrote a book called Freedom Papers. And Freedom Papers starts with the story of a woman who's known in Haitian sources as Rosalie de Nation Foulard, Rosalie of the Foulard Nation, who was enslaved in this period of time at the outset of the Revolutionary War in Foucault, ends up living as a slave in Haiti, gets her freedom, gets to Louisiana. There's an effort to re-enslave her, and she tells stories about multiple generations of this woman's offspring, both in Haiti and in France. The tabula rasa narrative that you cannot recover of the stories of what happens to enslaved Africans and their progeny has been demonstrated to be false, like over and over again. I'm tracking people to Haiti, I'm tracking people to Louisiana, and yes, they're there. And I want to say one thing about the broader framing of the question, because I gave a version of this talk at Washington University in St. Louis for a Black Studies audience instead of an Islamic Studies audience. And I framed it at that time in the following way. Most of the diaspora studies engagement with Africa asks a set of new world questions and then goes back in piecemeal fashion to look for origins or antecedents of a dynamic that they've identified in the colonial society. The story that I'm trying to tell in the First Atlantic Revolution has the advantage of working in the way that the history actually worked, which is that people who were embodied bearers of cultures and histories in West Africa lived out those stories outside of the African continent in ways that inform the shaping of the New World. This is the first story that I know of that takes an African movement and seeks to follow it through all of its Atlantic dimensions, both enslaved and, it seems harsh to call Clarkson bourgeois, but it's the first thing that comes to mind, right? That I'm trying to follow the ripples of this revolution, both in slave barracks and in polite drawing rooms. And that, I think, is a critical move in the way that we study the diaspora. And it's a critical move for Africanists as well. Because Africanists, and I said this in the presidential address of the African Studies Association this year, Africanists have to stop pretending that African history stops at the edges of the continent. One of the main sources that you can find for the political context of enslavement of Muslims in Senegambia in the 16th and 17th centuries is from Spanish sources, from New Spain and from the Andes. There are Jolofo slaves all over those sources, and they're telling you how they got captured, what political conflicts were taking place. And as Professor Khan knows as well as I do, Senegalese historians have never used Spanish sources from enslaved Senegambians to write about the 16th and 17th century history of Senegambia. The sources are sitting there, and we don't use them because we don't think that Africanists use diaspora sources. And diaspora folks don't tell stories that start in Africa. They ask questions that start in America and they go back to the answers.
Other questions? Yes.
Just to jump on what you just said. My name is Muntaz. Just to jump on what you said about Africa is writing about Africa from the continent itself. When it comes to the work of Chef Bamba, there is to me a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Definitely.
And we don't quite yet have the proper source yet. Is there someone that is actually working on that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So you asked about Sheikh Ahmed Bamba, the founder of the Muridiyya. The chapter 3 of the Walking Quran begins with Suleiman Ba hearing the recitation of the Quran by an enslaved man, and this sparks the revolution in Fukutola. It ends 100 years later with Ahmadu Bamba hearing the recitation of the Quran by an enslaved man in his father's courtyard, and it leads him to a social revolution. So in this text, I do situate Bamba in a broader history of anti-slavery thought. But to directly answer your question, Bamba's own corpus of scholarship is one of the most sadly neglected elements of humanity's cultural patrimony. This is an individual who wrote, just of what scholars have been able to catalog, 200 distinct books in the Arabic language. Some of them collections of as many as 200 distinct poems, some of those poems containing as many as 5,000 lines. I'm going to run the numbers real quick. And he wrote in all of the different disciplines of the Islamic religious sciences, and often versified very complex texts so that they became easily accessible and easy to memorize and to sing. But he also wrote volumes of praise poetry, and that Professor Khan mentioned my study of Islamic devotional poetry as being the kind of last part of my profile. I've translated some of Bamba's poetry in Jihad of the Pen in verse. So he writes in the prologue to his poem, or in the epilogue to one of his poems, bring joy to the messenger of God with these rhymes in every age and every hour for all eternity. So when it came time to translate the poetry, he specifically said rhymes. So I took a 166 verse poem that has 20 syllables per line, and I rendered it in 20 syllables per line in the English language, and I made it rhyme. And the effort to engage Bamba's poetry intellectually or in terms of its meter, in terms of its intellectual content, is still in its infancy. and indeed the effort to engage the African Islamic scholarly tradition. Professor Khan's book, Beyond Timbuktu, the book before that I loved the most was Non-Europhone African Intellectuals. It was the first person to actually ask the question, what do we mean by scholarship in Africa? When all you mean by scholarship is people that learn white people's languages. So Bamba is just a particularly striking case of an overall catastrophic situation of neglect. And I hope that in this talk, it becomes clear that the humanistic stakes of that neglect means that we risk missing crucial elements of what we think makes us us. That this isn't a story that can just be contained or confined either to Africa or Islam. This is a story about how freedom came into being. And unless and until we pay attention to this African Islamic scholarly tradition, we're going to be left recycling the lies that the white people told us about how they invented it themselves.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating lecture. What an enlightening hour this has been. Could you talk a little bit more about your new center, Israr? You said this isn't just about, could you link it up a little bit with some other issues?
So thank you for shameless plug number 5 now. So the short version is that the vision statement for Israr is to study race, religion, and revolution and the intersection of those. The race that's being invoked here is not just about modern conceptions of race, but about how human societies across time have constructed and understood human unity and diversity. How, so within a Quranic framework, for example, the human being is constructed as Bani Adam, the child of Adam, and that they're all related. When Ahmadu Bamba talks about racism as a subset of the broader Quranic sin of pride, he says the cure is to contemplate your body and how it was created. You begin your life as a nasty drop of sperm. You live your life as a walking sack of feces, and you end your life as a corpse, odious and rotting. You are all the children of Adam, and it is from dirt that you were created. He's saying, what meaning does it have for a being that's made of dirt to rank itself hierarchically against other beings made of dirt? And how much more absurd can it be for beings made of dirt to kill other beings made of dirt to possess more dirt on which to stand? That is a construction of what the human being is, what ties us together, what should and shouldn't separate us. That's needs to be part of humanity's common conversation about what racial and ethnic thought is. Who are you, child of Adam, is the way that it would be asked in Senegal. The religion part is defined in expansive terms. My definition of religion that I use in Visionaries doesn't have anything to do with Martin Luther nailing a series of lines to a church door. And my argument with the way that religious studies is constructed is that it's always built at some level on an engagement with the Eurocentric patrimony. What I understand religion to be in Islam is the sum total of human efforts to manage relations between the seen and the unseen world. That is a more culturally neutral and appropriate way of understanding a lot of religious and spiritual traditions, and even actually atheism fits within that framework. Because that which the human being can perceive with their senses and that which they can't is something that non-belief systems also have to manage, that which is seen and that which is unseen. So the religion in Isra is that. So that means, everything from, medieval Christianity to, one of the presenters coming in the fall works on textual tradition, textual embodiment in Japanese Buddhism. Like the idea is to have, and how that's tied to social change in the context that she studies. It's meant to ask a set of first-order questions about humanity, spirituality, and social change. And anybody that's interested in putting any two of those three together in a talk, holler at me. Like we'll get you out to Cali. Like you can come out in the wintertime when it's miserable here.
It is 2:30, and on that note, please join me in thanking Professor Ware again.